Żartobliwie mógłbym powiedzieć, że grono osób tutaj zebranych łączy jedno.
I could crack a joke here and say that the people gathered here is linked by one thing. We work with words. The father, the professor, the general even, and I hope that the general will convince us it's the case, not to mention a journalist, an analyst, and a politician. So we are talking about the practical application of this title, that is, words matter. It sounds like a slogan, but we might take a closer look and we will see that words indeed do matter. Professor, a question to you. By the way, even the titles of your works are an appeal to read more. Read more. Always true, that slogan. So tell us about education, the process of effective communication. Isn't it so that many issues with communication today stems from the fact that we were not ready? What happened, to be blunt? Well, I'm not sure whether we were or were not happy. We are supposed to talk about words and how they matter, especially in the context of the war. We could say that we are ready for war because we have been prepared for it. And war is a foundation, it's a major part, rather, of the European culture. What are the foundational texts that our education begins with? The Iliad, the Odyssey, two epics that teach us about the war, and on it continues until modernity. It's a shame I never looked at this thing statistically. I never looked at the mandatory reading list here in Poland and in Europe, how many texts are concerned with war, but I'm sure that it's going to be a sizable list, a sizable chunk. So, imagination. War should remain in the sphere of imagination, that's why we are here. So, memory and imagination. We are very well educated in this area. And secondly, what is it that we learn from literature about the war? On top of that, you've got pop culture that is flooded with the war. In computer games, you've got wars. Popular cinema is packed with wars. So people today, especially young people, are always immersed in those images of war. So no surprise there. That's the first take. The second take will be more linguistic in nature. So how is it that the war uses the language? You could say that even war manages the language. Actually, I'm going to tell you a cliché. People who prepare for war, they use languages very carefully. It's not only, or rather not really, about the words that you use, but what values are actually words saturated with. Death, very important word. It's different when we talk about our loved ones and their death. One death is good, the other is bad. You can saturate certain words with certain meaning. If you can control it, you will this war of meaning. And another perspective. A war may win over a greater or smaller number of allies. So various words and categories are to be mentioned here. This language will impact the supplies. And by the way, Ukraine has been very good at this story that it's been telling. It's a great success. I'm not sure if it was very well designed or whether they did it intuitively, but they told the story of the war very well. As a result, Europe and the world saw this war as their war, the war for their values. So we heard that it's a war for European values. There were certain signs that the Ukrainians used very well, the European flags and others that would be familiar to and liked by European democracies. Words are turned into an instrument of war when a war breaks out. It's not about objectivism. Those stories during a war are not about the truth or reflecting reality. It's about conquering and convincing. The last thing I'm going to say in this round, this literature of experience is quite important. Experience is used in a number of ways during a war. You try to highlight the experience of your own victims, and the traumatic experience of the soldiers are suppressed or covered up so as to control the soldiers' morale. So this is a major thing, very deep too, and goes hand in hand with the major instruments of war, that is armament. General Bieniek, you are one of the most popular experts that speak on TV. You are a high-ranking military officer, NATO's second in command in the US, and you need to translate the war into a language that will be understandable to the audience. Also, we heard that wars are turned into weapons, and the language gets more militarized. We continue to use certain phrases and words that are taken from the military language, even if we don't know exactly what they mean or whether we are using them right. So the language is militarized. So things that are linked to our military cannot be criticized. You must approve of our uniforms, of our soldiers. That's how it is. So tell us about this. Thank you very much for this introduction. Yes, words matter. Words are like bullets. Once you fight them, you cannot stop them. Although you have certain shells that once have been fired, you can reprogram them. But words matter. The words know no borders. Once you have spoken them, you have to know that you take responsibility for them, especially when it comes to military operations. I don't like this word expert, but I did participate in military activities. Serhiy stressed that they fight for their own country, which is true. But Shiite did fight for the country. They thought that they should have the power. People have their own goals and objectives. Let's talk about the media today. I mean, not the old school ones, like the press. I mean the social media and communicators. The new media have a greater impact than two divisions. They can destroy the image of what has actually happened in the battlefront. And on top of that, you've got the fog of the war, which only makes the situation more difficult. Basically, we do not have the true image of the war. So, in military operations, when you have a command, you have a number of things, how you've got a number of features. But you've got info ops and psy ops. It's a part of your military activity. So you need to inform your own forces and your own society, or the society that you act within. You need to project the right image. Sometimes the image that is in the media can harm what soldiers do, which is why you see disinformation. Mind you, not propaganda. You use disinformation that allows you to act on a proper scale and be effective. Let's talk about journalists. Those who are embedded, they would like to have first-hand experience. They do not realize that their message could harm our operation. I've experienced it a number of times. And you also see that in Ukraine. We've heard that Ukraine has won the information war. Not only words were used, but symbols too. Now, NATO pays a lot of attention to strategic communication for a good reason. They inform their own allies, but also the international society. But they're our adversaries, potential adversaries too. We inform, we tell them that we know what disinformation propaganda is, but we also have to tell our societies there is this center of excellence for this communication. It was set up in 2015 in Latvia. And that goes to show how important communication is for us. An example here, let me remind you. Putin had his own objectives in his military/special operation. Ukraine must be demilitarized, he said. What did he do? He militarized Ukraine. This is the most militarized country in the world today. He wanted to denazify Ukraine. What did he do? He de-Russified it. So he mentioned the fact that up to 5% of people support Russia. Russia is hated there after Bucha and other crimes committed by Russians. Putin wanted to change the architecture of security in Europe, and he was successful. Finland is in NATO, Sweden will be soon. He wanted to ignore the international law-based structure. He wanted to split the EU. He's been after dividing societies. He wanted Russia to be its foundation, and Russia would play a leading role. He failed. All the better. Propaganda and disinformation. Since the very outset, he's been using disinformation propaganda. And Gerasimov, the head of their headquarters, now the commander-in-chief, drafted a document in 2015. It's a textbook on hybrid war. Disinformation and propaganda played a major role there. And Putin fell victim of that propaganda. He would watch those marches and all this equipment before he invaded. There were those columns of tanks and helicopters. He came to believe that his army is so powerful that he will meet his objectives in 2 weeks' time. He fell victim to his own propaganda. We see that in this information is important. Now, what's the impact? What are the lessons we need to learn from that? Plenty of them. Just take a look. Look at media messaging from Ukraine. If it were not for that, the decision makers will not remember possibly how important civil defense is. Hospitals being bombed, infrastructure too, and it's working. You know, people are working, getting the money, transportation works. It's all civil defense, is it not? And another thing. Safety and security. We keep hearing about it. It's a major threat, by the way. So this lesson for us, for the West and Poland, we need to remember about integrated anti-missile and anti-air defense. I'm going to say that I'll be wrap up and then I'll continue speaking anyway. So NATO came together, and Western societies did too. People are willing to pay more to the coffers, so as to boost security. You, the military people, say only what you want to say unless somebody is an idiot and reveals secret documents. But it's another story. Senator Klich. You are the head of Foreign Affairs and EU Committee in the Senate. You're an active politician. You're campaigning now. You are working to win people's trust. I'll be pervasive in this question. You're fighting for people's support in your campaign, but you, politicians, are so involved in this that at times you adopt certain behaviors and mechanisms of the other side. And we were supposed to talk about the war. Yeah, we will get there. Civil war is a kind of war, is it not? I'd rather stick to the main subject of this panel, this conference. Rarely can you actually talk about these issues with so many people present in the audience. So a few fundamental questions here. What is it that we know what's happened in the last years? I don't mean since February 2022, but in the world, in this Euro-Atlantic region, which is of the greatest interest to us. What do we know? Before the war started, the US had taken a strategic decision that they would be returning to Europe. Do we know that? Do we know that it happened? And that is what largely determines what is happening in the war across the border. President Biden, well, unlike President Trump, decided to return America back to the world. President Biden decided to quit isolationism that Trump was in, and Trump turned this isolationism into its own doctrine. His slogan was, "Let's make America better or stronger." It was a false slogan. And this change took place in 2021. Do we know about the change or not?
Jest wiedza na ten temat.
It is my impression that we know precious little about that, we, the Polish society, and this is a weakness of communication, strategic communication here in Poland. Next point. Do we know that the European Union has demonstrated unique speed of action in the context of anti-crisis measures? We were able to observe it at the time of COVID pandemic, but it has changed even more since February the 22nd last year. Do we know actually that there has been a Copernican change within the European Union? Because a few years back the EU was never focused on financing armaments, transfer of armaments to any third country. And since February 2022, this is exactly what the EU is doing. Do we know how huge the funds are devoted to that area? Do we know that until August that year it's 5.6 billion euros devoted to this very cause? This is unprecedented. It's just part of the financial support of the European Union for Ukraine. The support for the Ukrainian state, making sure it can survive that wages, salaries, pensions are paid. Of course, here the support is even greater, about 11.6 billion euros last year for the macroeconomic stabilization of the budget. This year it's already 12 billion euros for the same purpose. And the EU, until the end of 2023, has devoted as much as 18 billion euros, not Polish zlotys, euros. And I'm not mentioning other types of support. Are we aware of that? And one more example. Do we know that Joe Biden, the President of the United States, has decided to rebuild the political unity of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? His predecessor believed that NATO is something that belongs to another age, and he did a lot to have no unity within the alliance, very often casting doubt on NATO, whether it's truly an alliance or maybe a collection of accidental member states. Do we know that the result of this reconstruction of the political unity of NATO, as a result of that, NATO was able to come up with a new doctrine at its Madrid summit last year, and also take fundamental measures that for us, for the safety and security of us along the eastern flank, they are of great importance for the future. We could say more, but I can see that Priest Sowa wants to say something. My question is, why do we know so little about that, or know nothing at all? Well, the reason is that we as a society, exactly, are part of what you asked us about. There is a certain rhythm of never-ending political fight, and this electoral campaign is its emanation, when the basic, most important issues for our safety and safety of Europe, actually, they are considered the point 15 on the list of priorities. It's not really a second point, but perhaps 15th. Nobody talks about that. Why does nobody say that the rapid reaction forces of NATO have been revamped from 40,000 up to 300,000 in the coming years? The process of change is now taking place. Why nobody speaks about new plans, so-called regional defense plans, that are about defense and support for countries under threat by Russia and Belarus from the very beginning? And this presence of the Allied troops in Poland and other countries of Central Europe, it's not only about making others unwilling to consider conflict, but actually in case of possible aggression. These are rapid reaction forces. And what I've mentioned, the American politics by President Biden, the EU policy based upon this Copernican change that actually was took place. And certainly there are different pressures. Much depends on the decisions of the voters. As today, for instance, in Slovakia, we will see whether Slovakia is going to continue its pro-NATO, pro-European course. Maybe there will be a change. There are dramatic challenges, as in the case of Poland. 8 years ago, Poland started to move away, sail away from the core of Europe, and is at the moment somewhere far, far away, outside the orbit of Neptune, if we consider it the last planet, not Pluto. So we are far away from the very center. There are therefore numerous challenges, and now concluding, if we don't really know where we are, where we stand, it's difficult actually to face the current situation and to face the challenges in front of us. Again, let me stress it, we need to have this knowledge. Thank you.
Jeśli Państwo szukają jakiejkolwiek informacji na temat tego, co się dzieje na Węgrzech.
If you are interested in information on Hungary, sooner or later, I think in the second or third text you will find on your screen, so you will find opinions of Dominik Héjj, an excellent expert in the events happening to the south in Hungary. Dr. Héjj, what can you tell us about the way in which Orbán managed to redefine the position of Hungarians with regard to the European Union, with regard to the war before this meeting, we spoke about a very interesting speech in the national radio station Kościół.
Dziękuję za zaproszenie. Jeśli przyjąć, że panowie zechcieli ładnie nakryć stół, to wtedy wchodzę ja i go wywalam. Bo to
Thank you very much. Well, let's say you have prepared, set the table, and I just enter and throw it over. Well, this is what often happens. This is the narration now, among others, in Hungary. And the troublemakers even not voting on the accession of Sweden to NATO. There is a regulation on the Prime Minister that actually bans new NATO bases to the east of the Danube, even on the Pest side of the capital. Such bases cannot be erected. There is a Tatar place on the western bank of the Danube. Not much changes here. So if we were to read about the narration, the texts in Hungary about the situation in Ukraine, first of all, the focus is on the return of Donald Trump, who is the only person able to end the war as quickly as possible. The narration about Biden is that he's basically an incapable person with a son who was deeply involved in the recent affairs, and also Twitter, the former Twitter, now X, but there have been references about theory and Americans trying to change the security architecture in the region. Some Hungarians complain that Russia would like to function the way it is, and Biden is trying to draw a line. Madiner, March 2022, when Prime Minister Orban said that the Poles will calm down when NATO forces are located along the border with Russia. That's why the Poles are very much involved in the war, so that those NATO troops are quickly along the line. Now, looking at the map, they would have to cross the Belarus. But again, stressing the fact that cooperation with Russia will be maintained. There is a certain idea of belonging to one church, being part of one church, that cannot be sanctioned. This can be proved by this policy of blocking sanctions for Kirill, the patriarch of the Muscovite Church. Prime Minister Orban and Deputy Prime Ministers also received highest orders by Kirill, also to one of the ministers who is actually responsible for state policy towards the church. So this shows that on the basis of Christianity, dialogue is possible. Some people smile actually that only Pope Francis is more pro-peace than Viktor Orban, who comes second as the most peace-loving person around the world. The Hungarians say that it's not their war, there are no values that Ukraine is fighting for. Ukraine is a fallen state, as some say, a collapsed state that survives only thanks to the lifelines received from the West. So this is the main narration that is being built. Is it really successful? Well, in the groupsec polls, very often the results are quite sad about the impact of disinformation, for instance. It looks like the Bulgarians, then the Slovaks, and on the third place, usually the Hungarians most susceptible to misinformation. So among the elites and the voters of Fidesz in the polls, if they are asked whether Russia is responsible for the war, these were median polls from last year, only 15% said that Russia was responsible for the war. NATO actually, in more than 50% of cases, people said that NATO was responsible. Let us remember also the speech of Transylvania. It used to be part of Hungary, today it's Romania, and the Hungarian Prime Minister spoke about new architecture of security, saying that Russia is building buffer zones around that. Quoting, unfortunately, they go through Ukraine because NATO is raising up arms and threatening Russia. This is the narration that seems to be dominant. Bucha, as it has been mentioned, Prime Minister said that we cannot really believe in what we see. So about Bucha and the events there, the Hungarians found out about it much later than others, and went from the Polish perspective. There were words that said that if someone cannot see what happened there, they should consult an eye doctor. But the system that has been constructed in Hungary since 2010, this was also based on the electoral loss of Fidesz in 202, when Prime Minister realized that he lost because he didn't have his own media. But now in all Hungarian households, actually, the media received to it the spread narration very close to the Kremlin's narration. The Hungarian press agency, after the beginning of the war, actually, they were saying all the time, the Russian special operation. Exactly the term used was just like the one used in Putin's Russia. Also, when I spoke to one of the priests here, we mentioned that when reports on misinformation in the Visegrad countries were mentioned in the context of the war, in Poland there were polls made very often confederation or even more extreme groups. In Poland, the mainstream party was the most extreme, Fidesz, that actually won the last election based on the narration. That later, actually, they confirmed themselves that it was not true, that the opposition wanted to send their troops to Ukraine so that Hungarians would be killed during this war. Today, the narration is that it's the Americans who want to have a new conflict, new Cold War that the Hungarians do not want to be part of. Let us remember also about the Hungarian minority, the Transcarpathian region, different calculations. I would say it's about 100,000. The government says 150,000 perhaps Hungarians living in Ukraine. But they're saying it's not, Hungarians are saying it's not our war, it's the war of two Slavic countries. Now, recently perhaps there is more and more information that the Russians were the aggressors, but we are actually also dying because our minority is dying there. It's just 30 people, roughly, perhaps, of Hungarian origin who died during the war. Hungarians opened their borders to everyone with passports, double passports, to those who stayed there. Actually, they wanted to fight for Ukraine. They remained behind, so they are very often used by the propaganda to prove that Hungarians are for peace, just like Pope Francis and the whole global South. This has been mentioned before.
Pani profesor Anna Siewierska-Chmaj.
I will go to perhaps the second subject that we are discussing here. Professor Myśliwiecka spoke about the policy of fear, how fear damages democracy. Can I ask you about this fear factor and to what extent is it present here? It's not our war, but the fear is ours. To what extent is it actually present here? How is it stressed as a certain way in which perhaps you try to change the emotions, the ideas of Hungarians? There are two fears, especially in Hungary, maintained all the time. The first is fear of mass migration. The Balkan Trail seems to be now alive and kicking again, but when it was limited, even at that time, almost every day there are pictures shown of migrants. There was not a single time when there was this extraordinary mode of operations since the beginning of the war in Hungary. But another threat, another fear is the Third World War. Different to Poland. This internal Polish war mentioned here, I think there is consensus that we should not actually have this fear of the Third World War, saying that perhaps we should manage perhaps within NATO. In Hungary it's very much different. There's this narration of fear built by the elites, by Fidesz, by Viktor Orban himself during his last speech in Transylvania. Again, he drew a new line where the Americans are losing their influence. China is to be the new dominant country, and with this new world order. Well, he did not say that he wants to be part of the Western American or European world, but he actually suggested that he might be willing to join the other one. So the basis of this permanent fear, but depriving people of information so that they do not know that we are part of the alliance, that NATO is there to help us. Hungary is also very much in favor of the European army. Emmanuel Macron had this idea, as you know, and Hungary is very much in favor of this idea. And now, yes, there are additional funds for the armaments, but nobody speaks actually that these are going to be the funds devoted to an army, Hungarian army, part of NATO, only later. Maybe sometimes on the margin NATO is mentioned. What is your perspective about this fear? Is it something that builds our vision of the world? Maybe it can also have an impact upon our behavior with regard to the choices we are making. Well, the fear is a terrible factor, and words play here a huge role.
Nasze strachy albo je
Amplify different fears. We can then perhaps. I've just had a review of the words used and different cliches that are applied in the context of the war in Ukraine. Even the soldiers themselves, they often say that they are fighting against orcs. Many of us, even if they are not fans of fantasy literature, we recognize immediately those creatures that have been created by Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings. And this is a typical, I think, approach. It's not really based on propaganda, because the soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, say that the Russians are beasts, not really humans, that can be compared or visualized as those terrible creatures, some monsters from the literary world, from fantasy. This conflict, I think, as a result, is moved to yet another higher, perhaps, level. It's not about war only, but I spent almost a decade reading Sienkiewicz, Polish writer. Some of you might say it's a waste of time, but reading Sienkiewicz, I think it makes it possible to also understand our world better, also understand our Polish history better. Sienkiewicz and Fire and Swords, the book that I think should be read with great interest today, and we should think perhaps more about some of those ideas there, especially in the context of Ukrainian students, school children in our schools, where I think we should be very careful discussing this book. But if you remember the very beginning of this book, Sienkiewicz speaks about civil war, a local war, perhaps not very important for world history, but he says 1647 was a strange year. He says there are many signs on heaven, on earth, and he speaks about this conflict also as if it were a global conflict, maybe a cosmic event, a war perhaps between good and evil. And the fear that you are referring to, I think it results from the fact that we are not part of one of the thousands of different conflicts, but this is a fundamental conflict about perhaps the existence or non-existence of humanity. And as this reference is very often made in the comments made by the soldiers, maybe this is a way to compensate their fears, additional motivation. If it is perhaps a result of a certain well-prepared rhetorics, well done then. It looks like patriotism today can use different types of languages. The war is also very good here at using different registers. In a way not very consistent, perhaps, because an orc perhaps perpetrating terrible deeds, raping, damaging, murdering. In some other context, in a film, for instance, he actually could be a poor boy born somewhere far from the center of the old Soviet Union, someone who actually was sent as cannon fodder to participate in the war. So how can you actually have the same person, sometimes an orc and sometimes a human being that we have feelings for? But this may be for the family also to receive this picture, so that there are people who have fear, maybe feeling for the family, that others also may look the same.
Tutaj kilka wątków zostało poruszonych. Świadomość sytuacyjna.
General fear. The issue is fear. Situational awareness and social education. Minister Klich has talked about it. Operational awareness and how you influence society, Dominik talked about it, are important. They are linked to the geographical location. You have the global south that is not excited about this conflict. And the further away you are, the less sensitive you are to conflict. We've heard that. Al-Sharak is this TV station covering the Gulf. On the other hand, on the other side, you've got a political scientist who teaches in Moscow at Vrishwov's University of Defense. And I'm being presented, and in the background, you've got military exercise. It was April last year, May, 2 months after the Russian aggression started. And you've got NATO exercises in the Baltic states F-35 and ships, and a question: why NATO has caused this conflict by supporting Ukraine and trying to expand it so that World War III breaks out and nuclear weapons are used? My response: apology. Sorry. Is it Ukrainian tanks attacking Moscow or Russian attacking Kiev? And the political scientist says, yes, but our tanks are there for a reason, because we want to liberate Kiev from the hands of Nazis. So you see how words influence the social awareness there. Then I'm in Saudi Arabia 3 months later, in the Emirates, and I'm talking to people, educated people, who see the actual situation, who are well read, but the general public react the way Fidesz shaped audience in Hungary would. So here it is. You've got videos and images. Videos, films are quite impactful. Black Hawk Down shows you what the war is like. Fortunately, Black Hawk Down almost happened nearby, but it did not. So we need to be careful when we inform, when we show things, because information can be a powerful and harmful weapon. Fear is less fearful and less terrifying in reality than fear in our imagination. This is what Shakespeare wrote. Maybe this is what you see in politics. This is like a rule of thumb. You have to scare people, and then you are received as a savior trying to help regular people. So what's it like from the context, when you look at it from the context of war and the political discourse?
No, w polityce na początku też jest słowo.
So, politics. It begins with a word. Let's look at the history of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. This is not the first chapter of this history. If you want to look at it, read Putin's article from 2021 on the historical proximity of those brotherly Ukrainian and Russian nations. And you can read everything there. What Putin sees it like, what the Kremlin elites see it like. When you read this article, you will learn a number of things. For the Kremlin, it's unimaginable that the Ukrainian nation would exist by itself, separately. Before the Soviet Union, from their point of view, it had never existed separately. So I was reading this article then, and it made me think of this lecture given to us in 2008 at the summit in Bucharest. It was when the decision was basically being taken on whether Ukraine is going to join NATO or not. And at NATO Russia's council, Putin would talk for 20 minutes. And he was saying that Ukraine is an artificial state. It was not a historical lecture. There was deeper political meaning to it. He was trying to tell us, politicians, prime minister, presidents, he was trying to tell us, if you go too far, if you invite Ukraine to NATO, then Ukraine will fall apart into parts it was made of. And he was trying to tempt Poles. After all, a part of Ukraine belonged to you, and he was tempting Hungarians. He was talking about a part of Ukraine, another one. And he spoke of what USSR used to do, because the way he saw it, it was the USSR that created Ukraine. And then there was a silence after he finished that lasted half a minute or so, and the Prime Minister of Canada was the first one to react. We were shocked. President Lech Kaczynski too, and his delegation with Minister Sikorski and myself too. We were there. It was a clear message. He was telling us where Moscow wants to do, what they would like to do with Ukraine if NATO goes too far when it comes to the subject of Ukraine integration with NATO. We knew that. And let me use this opportunity to remind you of something. That is why we took action to reinforce Ukraine and Poland too. Contingency plans, that is, scenarios of defending Ukraine, were negotiated then. And it was all because of what Russia did in Georgia and because of what we heard in Bucharest. There were other agreements about the military presence in Poland, because we're talking about the defense of Poland here. So I started with what you can read in this famous article penned by Putin. It was a cover-up. These were words showing the direction that Russia would take vis-à-vis Ukraine. We didn't know when, and this is where they went. Bieniek mentioned two, or rather three objectives. One, disinformation. Denazification is another thing that you've mentioned. It was nothing to do with anything real. Under denazification, they meant a coup to do away with the legal Ukrainian government. Well, all authorities, we remember those prescriptive lists that had been drafted by Russia. Demilitarization, what was that about? Well, the Ukrainian army was to be dismantled in 3 days. It was not about crashing Allied troops. They were not there. This was a myth. It was about crashing the Ukrainian military in 3 days. And the biggest lie that keeps being retold, that is the special military operation. I'm not sure if you know, Baku has been using a very similar phrase in the last week or two. So Nagorno-Karabakh lies within Azerbaijan. Its majority, until recently, were Armenians, but ultimately it was taken over by Baku. That resulted in an exodus of 120, so far 1,000 people, Armenians, and they fled from the very heart of their own nationhood, statehood. So words matter, and they precede a number of military and political actions. Gentlemen, more about it later, but first comment on the following. As we've heard, words matter. They are powerful. So a question. Look at politics and how the world is described. Look at those major players. What do they want? Do they want to impose their own vision? Or is it more about evoking emotions? Because these are two separate, disparate things. In other words, is propaganda more important, or rather, do they care more about building certain expectations within us? In other words, do they want to play on our emotions? This French political scientist wrote that today you cannot understand the world if you disregard studies on human emotions. We've got different experience here. We've got practitioners, we've got a politician and a military, and we've got analysts too. So, Dominik, please. So, let's take this Hungarian case. Propaganda and emotions need to overlap, but only because of the current landscape of the media system. Basically, it serves a certain purpose. So the Prime Minister and his people come up with something, and this concept, this notion, is then distributed all over the country, to towns, cities, and villages. Now, because of the war, many people ask, how come Hungarians who experienced 1956 can see Russia the way they see Russia. And yes, you could say that economy is different from history. You could explain it this way. But there has been this narrative around Ukraine. Ukraine has never been well received in Hungary. By the way, Hungarians continue not to take a clear stance on Nagorno-Karabakh. They are in good relations with the President of Azerbaijan. Also, there is another conflict in the Balkans. Prime Minister Orban met Vučić there only recently. He's Serbian. They were discussing Kosovo. Now when it comes to KFOR, the biggest constituent is Hungarian there. Speaking of European values, any values, only once did Orban spoke about it in 1999 when he said that Hungarians returned the West to its values and he was happy about them joining NATO. Later, basically, he made no reference to values at all. So you see that a problem can be created and then you can anchor it. Because of that, Hungarians can see the current policy, Hungarian policy. I remember when we walked with my grandfather in Hungarians and Russian was banned. But now it's changed. And now they believe that the Prime Minister knows more than they do and they know that it's good for them. And it is being reinforced. Hungary is not about 16 large city centers. No, there is Budapest and a number of towns essentially and villages. And you can see that you can reinforce this position and continue to live ever after. And this is what Fidesz has stepped into and benefiting from. So people believe that the Prime Minister knows more and better than they do. And Hungary is not only a country that does that. 2 million visas in last months. I'm talking about Schengen visas, not the national visas. Now you can exclude those issued to Ukrainians and Belarusians, and you're left with almost 400,000 issued to non-EU state citizens. Out of these, 250, 250,000, in other words, are those issues to people from Asia and Africa that come from a different type of culture, let me put it this way. So this is the scandal, visa scandal, and we are talking about the involvement of the Polish consulates. First residence permits, what are they? Well, these are special permits that allow us to move in. 450,000 last year, I believe. In the preceding year, 2021, 790,000 were issued. In the preceding year, 2020, over 500,000. So, in other words, in 4 years, we have issued the largest number of first resident permits. Some have received both, but there is also the work permits because they are issued because of the work. Some of those who have received these visas, some of them have never taken up work here in Poland. They simply moved. They disappeared into thin air. Where to? Probably other EU member states that belong to Schengen, excluding Germany. However, there is a pressure on the German job market. It was the biggest, and those people were most interested in the German market. I'm talking about it because you can obtain it from the official ministry website. Eurostat can tell you the same story. They have been there for a long time, these data, available on the website. So they're trying to convince you that there is no scandal, no visa scandal. I'm not talking about the scale of corruption. This is not what I'm discussing here. What I'm discussing is this scandal, a legalized effort to move migrants into the Schengen zone. And I can defend every single word of what I've said. Legalized effort to move migrants into Poland and the Schengen zone. This is what they are afraid the most at this point. So they're coming up with various disinformation activities that are to be a cover-up. They are supposed to cover up the biggest scandal linked to the ruling authorities. It is an international scandal, a huge scale. See, it's linked to corruption. And the scale of corruption is huge. It's linked to the companies that acted as middlemen. We don't know about the scale of the Polish officials' corruption. Irrespectively of the scale of said corruption, remember, the scale of the operation itself is huge. And in one of the referendum questions, we're going to be asked, are you in favor of the current Belarus border fence? Okay, let's talk about the media. We can be rid of emotions there. Mr. Klich might have said the truth. He did. And you should be truthful. You should separate the problem from the human being. You need to look somebody in the eye and simply speak a simple language. One of the experts said, soon there'll be a battle. And basically, has anyone understood what I've just said in Polish? Nobody. This was quite specialized a language, right? So, you have to be careful, but emotions will be there. We agree on certain things. There are attempts to impose the image of the world, and emotions are linked to it. These are things that are linked. Yesterday, Professor Głowiński died, and this book is a tribute to him. He used to be a giant of the 20th century Polish humanities and art studies. This is a very important, he wrote an important book on what we're discussing today. And Głowiński mentioned two important things. Rhetoric, words used as weapons. Once you've done that, you eliminate the dialogue. So, if you use language as a tool to wage a war, the war in Ukraine or the civil war waged here, it eliminates a conversation. We no longer speak to have a dialogue, but to impose a certain image of the world. Not to those who are different, but ironically impose it on your own people, people who support you, and emotions there are simply a necessary part of the exercise.
Thank you very much. I'm quite convinced we could speak for hours on those subjects. It is time for Q&A, however. Maybe 3 questions together and then time for answers. And please also mention who you direct your questions to.
3 pytania, może tak. I później, jeśli mogę prosić, to też do kogo ewentualnie są skierowane.
To pose a question about a small word, very important, I believe, for the Polish society, at least for me, it is of utmost importance. It's about a recognition for the sovereignty and bravery of the Ukrainian society. Here, a question about an advert. In Ukraine and others, the situation is not stabilized. What is your position here? And the theorists, practitioners of Polish. Well, I think it has been already said that we say in Ukraine. There is the Polish word in or on, but I think that it's very much about the expectations also. So we should, I think, be saying in Ukraine, wy in Polish. Przemysław Malicki, question to General Bieniek. Your question about your current assessment of the modernization of the Polish army. The Polish government, do you think it's moving in the right direction? Thank you. Very briefly, if I may, the plan for the technical modernization is the result of the strategic doctrine based on the secret part, probably not issued by the Polish president, although it should have been issued. But as you know, well, today it's a big construction site where very often the head of the construction is missing. Next questions. But again, not to leave it like this. Yes, it's a very broad program, but it has to be more systemic. Not just buying one rocket here, 4 tanks here, 2 aircraft over there, but synchronization, good plan is needed. As we said, priorities. The minister knows, I think, very well what I'm speaking about. You too, anti-air defense. I think muscles is not enough. You need to have the software, so the brain is needed. The system of systems, yes. Next questions from this side of the room, please.
Dzień dobry, Marcin Łuczak.
Marcin Łuczak. Good afternoon. I am a diploma engineer, so maybe I'll not be choosing words properly. Well, I'm not an expert in arts and humanities, but a question to President Klich. The word certainly has its power. Logos, the very word, is a certain order. Logos is in early Christian culture is about divine power as well. So I think we all have to know, and we do know, that words are linked to power, but also a certain selection of words you use is also very important. And in politics, it plays a very special role. For this reason, what I'm interested in is why in the world of politics we don't have a group of experts that would actually explain to the society some words, panel words, where on television very often someone speaks about inflation. It seems that many people have no idea that inflation or the fall of inflation doesn't mean exactly that the prices are falling. Some people speak about the recovery plan, 150 billion zlotys. For most people, more than 1 million is unimaginable. Why don't we, I don't know, use some comparisons, translating it into kilometers of newly built motorways, for instance? Very often, I can see on television that only some people, perhaps, in our society are able to understand what journalists speak about. Better, I think, translation, explanation should be needed. I don't quite know what to tell you, because contemporary politics is just like that. In the history of democratic Poland, we had electoral campaigns, and at least a bit, in a certain way, they were about the discussion about the future of the country. Some were in favor of solution X, others prepared Y, some were supporting this or that option. But the campaign, as it is now, today, is very much devoid of any discussion about the future of Europe, the way its shape is going to take tomorrow or in 2 days' time. Those subjects have disappeared totally. Of course, it is the role of the politicians, rational, reasonable politicians, to try to keep to facts, but a clear majority of them do not keep to facts. When I called to the recent meeting of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and EU Affairs, and we wanted to speak about this visa affair, we had a Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs present at the meeting. At the very beginning, he sat in a place where cameras would actually see him very well. He moved like that, changing by 45 degrees, somewhat like that, so that he's better filmed by the cameras present. And he was behaving as if he were actually taking part in an electoral meeting of his party. We were not able to get from him answers to the questions that we were posing at that time. We couldn't give any answers about the numbers, among others, the numbers that I just presented. So this is the current dynamics of the electoral campaigns, and politics, well, the world of politics is very much similar. The question is, are we going to be able to heal our politics? But this, well, depends in the case of Poland. very much on who is going to be supported by the majority of the society in the coming electoral elections, Polish parliamentary elections in October, the 15th of October. Hopefully we will not have a repeat of Orwell situations, because the most Orwellian case in the recent history of Poland was to give the name of the government institution that actually distributes government grants to organizations that are sometimes created just a week, sometimes before the deadline, or sometimes a few days earlier, and the size of the grants is sometimes so high that they in total go up to about 1 billion Polish zloty, and it's called the National Freedom Institute. This institution has been given this name. It's difficult, I think, to find a more Orwellian institution that has been created by the Law and Justice Party, by this institute that is responsible again for creating this situation of governmental, non-governmental organizations. How do you like that? A bit like Hungary. Another perhaps a question, Senator Klich already mentioned that. Question about Hungary again. How do the Hungarians, maybe more politicians, Hungarian politicians, how do they see the elections in Poland? How do they perceive also the elections in Slovakia tomorrow, or today actually, today already? Today the end of the voting until 10 p.m. in Slovakia today. The elections in Slovakia are important for Hungary. Orban very much hopes that Robert Fico is going to be the winner, his political party. They would also like the Hungarians to be present in the Slovak parliament. They are not part of the parliament since 2020. It actually ended with a big dispute between the Minister of Foreign Affairs of both countries. Minister Siarto actually said he was visiting Upper Hungary. He was in Slovakia, of course, but some Hungarians still call it Upper Hungary. And he was supporting the local head of a party called Alianza Szövetség in Hungarian, that means alliance. And he also declared another program of subsidies for those countries with Hungarian capital present in the area. And the Hungarian ambassador actually was called to appear in front of the foreign minister. Protest actually was presented that Hungarians are involved in the elections in another country. The same actually happened in Ukraine before the war, when there were elections there. It was also criticized that the Hungarians were very much active there in the Transcarpathian region. It seems clear, very clear, that the Hungarians say that they should vote for Hungarians, not Slovak parties. It will make it possible to participate for the Hungarians in the work of the parliament again. And as for Poland, I think it's obvious to everyone what the expectations are. But as for the Polish election and the narration of those in favor of the government line, many say that this is a fundamental election. The narration that is very similar to the one that was presented in the context of the Hungarian elections. There are also some saying that maybe there is an opportunity, especially in the media, in favor of the government line, that the Polish-Ukrainian conflict will make it possible to return to normal Polish-Hungarian relations. This is very often stressed. And at the same time, and at that time, this clear line is much stronger than the one in Poland. The idea is to prove from the Hungarian perspective that the Hungarians were always right, and the Ukrainians simply would not be able to count on long-term support from those countries. It's interesting to see the current shape of Hungarian-Ukrainian relations. They're actually improving. Yesterday, OTP, National Bank, was removed from this list of shame, those operators that financed the war. Why is it interesting? Because Viktor Orban used to say that as long as this issue is not properly regulated, the Hungarians would be blocking further EU assistance for Ukraine. And now, in theory, in an automatic way, the decision should be reversed, but what is going to happen is of perhaps secondary importance. More questions from the room? Yes, please. Alexandra Goraj. I live in Luxembourg. Came here especially to participate in this conference. And traveling to work, I listened to France Inter, a French radio station, in the morning. There's a broadcast containing very interesting, covering interesting subjects. One of them is one on geopolitics. And a few days ago, when the focus was on Ukrainian grain and other crops, Some asked why did actually Poland change its position so much from a big ally transformation into basically an enemy of Ukraine. I decided to listen even more attentively, listening to the comments of the commentators. And the commentator actually said very briefly that here it's very much about the electoral campaign in Poland, where the government is trying to show its position, very tough position, to get more votes. And additionally, some satisfaction perhaps could be heard in his voice that Poland so far has been a country that was actually telling others, teaching others, also the French, saying that we all need to help Ukraine. And now Poland declares that it will stop its assistance to Ukraine, becoming an ally of Russia as a result. I'm just wondering what your opinion on this is, because, well, I was quite shocked actually when I got to my office. The behavior of the Polish government in this case is nothing new, because this is the type of the politics of this government between 2016, 2020 until basically January 2022. The politics was focused on the past, not looking into the future. This was the politics, the line of the current government that was basically about the rather cool relations with Ukraine. If I remember correctly, speaking off the top of my head, but I think the first visit of the Polish Prime Minister, Morawiecki, of course, was only in 2020. It was the first visit. Between 2016 and 2020, there were no visits of the Polish Prime Minister to Kiev. I think the president visited Ukraine a bit earlier, but it took, I think, years also. I think it was 2019 only. And as for Polish-Ukrainian relations, they, in a very radical way, were changed as the result of the Polish legislation, Polish Act on the Polish National Remembrance Institute. It was a problem for Polish-Israeli relations, also Polish-US relations, but also for the relations with Ukraine. At the moment, the Morawiecki government basically is going back to its roots. Why? Yes, of course, because of the electoral campaign, but in the years 2016, 2022, there were just 3 different electoral campaigns, and this rather cool distance position, Polish position towards Ukraine, this was the typical position of the Polish government for years. Why? The reason is that one of the important parts of the electorate of this current government are anti-Ukrainian groups of people, milieus, and Morawiecki is very much hoping to get further support from those voters. It certainly is not in line with the Polish raison d'etat. And as for the strategic issues, I think there is no free, no safe Poland without independent Ukraine. That's very clear.
Tak, to jest doraźna socjotechnika.
Thank you. Yes, these are social and technical examples of our Polish propaganda. If you want to really understand what happens in the Polish society in more serious perhaps for more serious reactions to the conflict, the war, I think we should read literature, just like trying to understand the Russians. I would still recommend reading Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, or Gogol, because very clearly you can learn more about those paradoxes and the mysterious ways in which the Russian society behaves. You can learn from literature more than from current analysts, political analysts. And I think when we speak about trying to understand different social behaviors, deep behaviors with some perhaps deep structures in operation that are very difficult to understand, I think we were somewhat surprised, we as Polish society. And I think this is an edifying experience, one of the most edifying experiences within my fairly long life. Even some of those who were warning, saying that this is going to come to an end, that Poles can be enthusiastic supporting Ukrainians for a week or 2 or maybe a month, and then we'll get more and more irritated. But no, it did not happen. Maybe the level of enthusiasm is going down. It's not unnatural. There is a certain, perhaps, pool of empathy that we have, a bit like an energy capital that is not never-ending. But I think it's quite stable. We can speak about a stable level of support for Ukraine. And I am greatly interested in what actually happened to us since February last year, over the months when we were trying to help Ukrainians, observing what was happening there, how this very high level of our problems with Ukraine. Many people were not very much in favor of Ukraine, very much because of the problem in Volhynia in 1940s. I'm not saying that the problems have been solved. I agree with those speaking in the previous panel that this is still a very big subject for us to process, to think over. But it seems that those sentiments have disappeared for a while at least, or have become weaker. The languages of the propaganda, especially the dominant propaganda, also play a role here. But I think that this attitude, social attitude, is something positive for me. It's not really easy to manipulate us, our opinions. If I may, well, still on an optimistic note, thank you. One more comment. Maybe I will deepen still the idea of you, Minister, speaking about the strategic interest of Poland. Yes, this strategic depth. 1,200 kilometers from the Donbas to Lviv, certainly the space plays a very important role for us, and time. If some do not understand that, just have a look at the map. And one more or two questions from the room. Yes, please, to General Bieniek. In the military milieus, what is the approach? What do people think, or maybe speak, not always in a public way, on the following issue? What after the 15th of October can bring about general confusion in the country? After perhaps 3 months, maybe we'll have a minority government that is going to fall. And in this convention, what would be the reaction of Moscow? Moscow might want to perhaps punish Poland for supporting Kiev. Is there any discussion, maybe any thoughts on that among the military, and is there any concept and idea about what's going to be done? Marek Logier is my name. A question and a comment, very in-depth question. Yes, in general, as you said, the difference between the general and captain is that the general knows things in general and the captain knows perhaps more. The interests of the country are defined in the national strategy that I can send you to. It's not a secret document. Thank you. That's all from me.
Ostatnie pytanie, proszę bardzo.
Last question, please. Please wait for the mic. It seems then that the whole burden of political and military thought in Europe and in the world possibly shifted to Central Europe to some extent. So a question to the general and to the senator. After the war broke out, we heard that it would be over soon. And many politicians claimed the following. If we help Ukraine significantly, then, because of our past, it would be possible to form a federation with Ukraine. In other words, to recreate an agreement that we struck with Ukraine in the 17th century. Others claimed that such a move would be impossible. I know that we are gazing into a crystal ball here, but what do you think about it? If it were to come about, we would be a true power. Is it possible? Is it feasible?
Marian Apostoł.
Very much, Marian Apostoł. As we know from history, this union came too late. The previous union, struck in Pereslav, that defined the Polish and Ukrainian history for the next 3 centuries. So Pereslav Union and everything that happened after 1648 shows the strategic truth that we are experiencing today. As long as we come to an agreement, as long as Kiev and Warsaw cooperate, and there is no room for the third side to come in, those countries benefit. But if we move away, if we part, then both of those countries lose. And we saw that happen a number of times, and it was quite evident. It does not mean that two countries, one of which is a member state, an EU member state, could form a federation. To me, it's a vision that's, the kind of visions that you see when major historical changes happen before our eyes. So, Ukrainians are defending their own country and they are provided with Western support. And that's a historic event. And I know what I'm going to say is a cliché, but this war is not only a war fought to keep Ukraine independent. Rather, it is about the order of the world, whether it is going to be at least partly built on values, or rather, whether it is going to be built on the will of authoritarian rulers. Tony Blair Institute made this study. There are two populisms, Western, Central and Eastern ones. The Western infects political culture, it reverses concepts. Trump's rule showed that. Central European populism, like in Hungary, destroys the democratic institutions. Partly it's happened in Poland, and the Eastern European populism, which is a bloody populism, as it spills blood. President Putin represents this East European populism. If he loses, it is possible that this rules-based order is going to survive these difficult times. If, God forbid, Putin succeeds, then what we have in Article 2 of the Lisbon Treaty and the preamble of the Washington Treaty is going to be questioned globally, and surely, if it survives, it's going to be limited to the West, broadly speaking, Canada, the US, and the European allies. Before you start reading this study, remember Ogniem i Mieczem, By Fire and Sword by Sienkiewicz. Cossacks was the only social force that could be the kernel of the Ukrainian society. And we pushed them into the arms of Russia, and then those Cossacks pacified our national uprisings. So now we know what might happen if Ukraine is pushed back into the arms of Russia. It's good to think with literature, through literature rather. Thank you for this debate. Dominik Héjj, Bogdan, Klich, General Bieniek, and Professor Koziołek. Thank you.
Profesor Koziołek, dziękuję bardzo. Dziękujemy Państwu. Kolega prezes, jeszcze ważna informacja.
Proszę Państwa, bardzo dziękuję za Wasz udział w konferencji. Odnoszę wrażenie, że ksiądz Kazimierz jest bardziej...
It seems like Father Kazimierz is more likely to say something biting than I am. Thank you for your participation in this conference, ladies and gentlemen. I represent the organizer, and I believe that it's been a very good conference. That's how I see it, and I believe that you have liked it. At least this is the impression I get when I see the turnout. On the first day, almost 200 people present. In Sukiennica, in the cloth hall, I believe between 220 and 250. Today, in the room, over 150. Rarely do we see a turnout like that on a Saturday. Thank you very much for that.
Proszę Państwa, będziemy mogli wszystko zobaczyć.
Everything can be seen and heard online. We're going to post it on Monday on our website. Ms. Machinska said today that she gave an interview and 250,000 people saw that interview. It impressed me. 250,000 will not see this debate, I believe, but you might do some linking or tagging. It might help. Because, you know, when we see your involvement and that you come in huge numbers, it pushes us forward. Mr. Halicki made a declaration yesterday. Today, Father Manuel said that we will continue this work and that the space is very friendly. Then, next year, we should meet here. At least we would love to meet here. And thank you to the interpreters. Thank you to the technicians, says the speaker. Without them, everything would not work the way it has worked.